Okay, so I'll begin. In the 1970s, microbiologist Carl R. Woese, who you see on the left, challenged the existence of two kingdoms, the bacterial kingdom and the eukarya kingdom, for classifying living creatures, with his discovery of a third form of life, archaea, which you see here, or single-celled microorganisms. While such a discovery initially seemed to be minor in terms of its possible impact on knowledge, archaea ushered in a radically new understanding of biological heredity, and with it challenged the dominant visual analogy for communicating this process in the West, the image of the tree of life. So with its two major limbs representing two kingdoms, and this is one of Charles Darwin's drawings, which he began to articulate this idea of a tree of life. The tree of life was one of Darwin's chosen metaphors, an image from nature that provided a near diagrammatic model for his evolutionary thinking. From a common origin in the trunk, as you see here, life evolves and adapts as articulated through a tree's radiating system of branches. To Darwin's two primary limbs, Woese's archaea introduced a third kingdom, or what he called a domain, where Darwin's tree suggested how genes flow vertically, that is, from individual limbs and from branch to twig. And so it's important to think, with Darwin's tree and this image, the idea is that evolution flows vertically from branches and then to twigs. Woese's research documented how, as one New York Times writer put it, DNA itself can move sideways between limbs and across barriers from one kind of creature into another. So this idea that with these three branches, you actually have these lateral transfers, that something in the bacterial kingdom or the DNA from bacteria can show up in your archaea is the same, how does this happen? And so this is what is called horizontal gene transfer in scientific parlance. But what would horizontal gene transfer mean in the realm of artistic practice? To begin to answer this question, I turn to Daniel Steegmann Mangrané's 2018 exhibition in Sao Paulo. In so doing, I chart what such horizontal transfers might look like as the subject and object of art, and how such transfers bear on a different understanding of artistic inheritance. So in the street-level gallery of Mendes Wood in Sao Paulo, Steegmann Mangrané suspended his environmental sculpture A Árvore Entrelaçada, or Tangled Tree, which occupied the center of the space. The work consists of cables hung from the ceiling's exposed rafters, intersecting to form an irregular, open, and downward-pointing structure. Oops. So you can see the open rafters of the gallery here, and it's very hard to see the wires, but there's this open wire structure from which these different pods are hanging. So hanging from the cables were 164 elongated brass and nickel-plated brass forms, their varying weight and distribution articulating the structure's angles and upside-down open pyramidal form. The work is vaguely reminiscent of Venezuelan artist Gego's seminal Reticularia, which also used metal wires and abstract geometry as an ideal formal grammar through which he articulated the work's various nets and meshes. Back to Daniel Steegmann's Tangled Tree, one initially wondered if Steegmann Mangrané had intended for the array of forms suspended on the wires to mimic pieces of vine or rope, or even some animal, perhaps a snake, or a single part of an animal, like a tail. As it turned out, these forms represented the pods of the tree known as the chuva de oro, or golden rain. But this tree of cables, so his tree of cables, lacks a common origin in a trunk. Its reticular branches do not spring upward from one to another, but suggest lateral transfers from one branch to the next. Consequently, the work suggests less the traditional image of the tree of life than the entanglements between species, and perhaps even between the organic and inorganic. Other sculptural work, such as Natureza Geometrica Biologia, or Geometric Nature Biology, which actually opens the exhibition at HangarBicocca as the first images you see walking into the space, displays an entanglement between the organic and inorganic more literally. In this work, two sections of a branch sliced in half are held about 1.5 inches apart by metal wires and are suspended horizontally within 3 tensed cables hung from the ceiling to floor. Steegmann Mangrané's exploration of the connection between the living and non-living, in this case, the non-living would be the metal and the living would be the tree branch, suggests his interest in Amerindian cosmologies that see the nature-human divide as less fixed than often imagined in the West, and that approach the life of nature and of things as imbued with humanity. Thus, to Wose's horizontal gene transfer, which disrupts the West's evolutionary schema, the artist would have likely added, and I quote now the artist, "Within Amerindian cosmology, everything is human. It doesn't mean that everything is a human being in the biological sense of the word, but means that humanity is at the core of every being. The common and shared ontological ground for every being is not nature, but humanity." End quote. Consequently, in this work, which literally visualizes the mutual intertwining of the natural and artificial, the forms of the living and non-living, Natureza Geométrica Biologia also asks viewers to reconsider the conceptual constraints that claim matter and metal as inert substance, that place the inorganic in opposition to the organic, and that position human subjectivity in opposition to things. Key here is that through his artistic practice, Steegmann Mangrané shows how these relations are lively and how their materializations might be subject to revision and change. And so this is perhaps my favorite work of the exhibition, I must confess. So the artist's exploration of the organic and inorganic, animate and inanimate, also extends to an investigation of how recording technologies materialize perception in relation to biology. His 16mm film, Phasmids, begins with a medium shot of a natural and artificial environment. Branches, as you see here, and bark and leaves are eventually wrapped in a gauzy white paper with a decorative light green and pink pattern that identify the material as disposable paper towels. So it's hard to see in this image, but you see this little like green and red, right? And so after looking at this very carefully, you see that it's just paper towels, like basically kitchen towels that you might use to wipe a counter, that he's inserted within this seemingly natural environment. This and the subsequent shots explore the same environment. Nothing moves, though the film frame slightly trembles. The next sequence, which you see here, captures a second environment in which a white geometric structure is folded in on itself, creating crevices and shadows that are further revealed in the shots to follow. The film explores this structure and eventually introduces tree bark among its folds. These two sequences establish the context in which the film's action unfolds. And so we're now going to switch to a clip of the film, and I'm going to show you 3 minutes of the film, which then you can see again. We'll look at from 9 minutes to 12 minutes. And there are stick figures in the film. I didn't mention that, but you'll see them moving, these phasmids, right, which gives name to the title of the film. Thank you. So we're cueing the video and we'll return to the PowerPoint. I always tell my students that I like films where nothing happens. And they look at me like... I say, the less that happens, the better. I had a friend tell me that then that means I really like photography. It's just stasis, but... Oh no, let's stop. We'll come back to this. Let's go to the PowerPoint. Yeah. Perfect. Thank you. Well, we just watched the clip, so I'm going to describe the clip we just saw. So as we saw in the clip, the one from 9 minutes to 12 minutes, and I'm going to go back to here. The film presents fixed frame shots that record this setting from various angles and distances. In some shots, everything is still, and in others, a stick insect moves and then comes to rest. At around 11 minutes, the scenery reverts to the white geometric structure, which in the course of the shots to follow occupies the entire visual field. In front of this background, various scenes unfold. An isolated stick insect moves, insects commingle with branches, or we perceive only branches given the lack of perceived movement. Eventually, the film introduces a single white surface with no visible breaks. At this point, intersecting stems and branches replace the angles of the geometric structure, while the branches' forms become blurred due to limited depth of field. And so I now want to actually go to back to the film and just watch these 45 seconds from 16 minutes to 16 minutes and 45 seconds. No, the other one, yeah. That's good, yeah, that's fine. I'll draw your attention to this here. Okay, we can return to the PowerPoint. Thank you. So at 16 minutes in the clip we just saw, what seems like an out-of-focus branch, so this right here, begins to move. Here, one witnesses the spectral movement of a being whose very name, phasmid, derives from the Latin phasma, which means a ghost or apparition. The shot recalls George D.D. Uberman's observation, and I quote, "The phasmid makes its own body into the scenery which hides it, by incorporating the scenery where it was born," end quote. But he's really referring to the phasmid incorporation into nature. Where D.D. Uberman calls attention to the phasmid's assimilation to surrounding nature, Steegmann Mangrané's use of white as a monochromatic background casts in relief how filmic equipment produces a similar spectral dissolve into the world through deliberate shifts in lighting and limited depth of field. Especially when framed against the white background, one notices the insect's slim antennae, as well as the irregular, bulbous body that diverge from the surrounding branches. So this is, part of that bulbous body, as is this here. The film is as much a field of perceptual training as it is an amplification of the Phasmid's spectrality through the artist's use of limited depth of field. As a film, Phasmid's thus unfolds two symmetrical investigations. In the first instance, it is a film about human perception, the psychology of perception, and how one distinguishes figure versus ground in a situation in which those categories are rendered unstable by creatures that visually blend with and adopt the forms of their environment. In the second instance, the film calls into question stable ontologies of self and other by foregrounding how technology impacts and produces such distinctions. That is, how technology captures the world. In this way, the film reveals technology's entanglement with one's desire to know, to see, to categorize. Just as the intermittent flashes of frames of color announce that the film reel has finished and that the film is moving on to the next celluloid strip. And this is one of these moments in terms of the materiality of the film that you saw in some of the sequences that I showed, that you'll have this like flash of red color, which basically means that the film strip has run out and another one is initiating, really drawing attention to the actual filmic technology of inscription. Steegmann Mangrané's attention to the material components of the filmic medium also engaged the history of structural film. In the 1960s, the materiality of film became the self-reflexive subject and object of film practice, as fixed camera position, flicker effect, and loop printing, and rephotography off the screen became structural film's defining techniques. In the case of Steegmann Mangrané, his embrace of filmic materiality raises the question about the nature of matter and the place of the embodied human within the material world. And I'd like to show you this complete film, which is about 4 minutes and 53 seconds. It's also in the exhibition. And then we can talk, I will continue talking about that film. So if we can go to the next film, and it has sound. So. Are we able to put the sound on the film? We can go back to the PowerPoint now. There's still some sound in the background. Maybe from the next Vimeo. I'll continue. So, in terms of the film we just saw, with 16mm, the artist redeploys the lessons learned from structural film. He worked with an engineer, Stefan Kanawa, and he modified Paulo Nazareth. That's a different artist. He's from Brazil. He wanted his prime time debut at HangarBicocca, so it's all. Okay, so we're back to the modified 16mm film camera. So he modified the camera so that the camera would move along a tension steel cable at the same speed that it shot film. And so, as you can see here, the tension steel cable, and it was actually suspended about 3 meters above the Mata Atlântica forest floor. In the ensuing film, 1 meter of film is projected every 5.46 seconds, yielding a single traveling shot with a constant speed that produces a bodiless advance among the foliage and trees. And I think this is what's kind of so stunning about the film, is that you feel that there's something artificial moving that camera. It's decidedly not a handheld camera aesthetic, right? And that it's just kind of suspended and moving at this pace, going through the forest. This formal mechanism interacts with the work's rainforest setting to create a heightened perceptual effect. As the camera advances, we experience the ways in which the forest's undifferentiated ground is at once pure surface and pure depth. We experience the forward motion as artificial. Hung in a perfectly straight line, the camera's movement produced a sharp cut within the entangled forest we see. 16mm dramatizes how such cuts are human and technological through a structural analysis of film recording technology, and in so doing, allegorically calls attention to the rainforest as a space of various levels of entanglement between nature and technology, and beyond that to conflicts, both past and present, conflicts that are ecological, geographic, historical, territorial, and colonial. And I should say that these larger conflicts are never literally illustrated in Daniel Steegmann Mangrané's work, but I think are allegorically brought to attention through the kind of heightened perceptual attention that he grants to the forest and the Mata Atlantica in his work. That the separation between subject and object is an artificial production or cut within an always already entangled ontology made up of material and discursive phenomena is explored also in Phasmit's final shot. And I think I'm going to skip this video and just move on to the next. So basically at the end of the film, in a film that's otherwise composed of these fixed frame shots that we see, there's a panning shot that shows various objects placed on a windowsill. You see here. And that shows the various film props. So all of this to say that at the end of the film, there's this panning shot that moves from the environment that he's created in his studio to show the actual site of the work's production. The film ends with an abrupt camera movement that you see the ultimate final shot. You see this Energizer battery package, branches, a piece of paper, boxes, part of the prop structure. The film dramatizes the inherent relationality between representational efforts and material reality in ways that account for how such practices mattered and could be reconfigured for our understanding and experience of the world. The artist's table in this final shot, so this studio image that you see at the end of Phasmit's, also recalls Steegmann Mangrané's Table with Objects, which is also on exhibition, which is a work that he began in 1998 and is actually ongoing. This work presents various objects with which he works to model, test, and experiment. With it, he foregrounds the setting for aesthetic thought, the artist's studio, in relation to objects, where, as the artist explains, and I quote, "things find place to establish their relationships," end quote. Where Phasmit's produced a perceptual drama that ultimately revealed the artist's studio as the artificial site of production, Table with Objects provides another type of exposure, we'll say behind the scenes, whereby what is on display is the potential process and experimentation in relation to materials, while the conception of a finished work proceeds from view. Steegmann Mangrané, in describing how such a stance informs his artistic practice, explains, and I quote, "If there are not subjects and objects in fixed positions, there are no artworks or viewers in fixed positions anymore either, but a dynamic relation of mutual transformation," end quote. Such an open-ended and dynamic organization also drives, albeit in a different form, the artist's series of watercolors titled Cobra Sipo, or Vine Snake, which are executed on graph paper, some presented individually and others in pairs. So these watercolors were actually shown just below the Tangled Tree in 2018. And the watercolors recall in part the Lichtwand series, which is the extended watercolor series that you see basically in the second space as you go into the exhibition. But with Cobra Sipo, the gridded support is isometric, made up of triangles instead of squares. The ensuing watercolors show sequences of triangles, rhombuses, trapezoids, and parallelograms, abutting corners with one another and shifting directions, following the path of a barely visible graphite line, while hue, yellow, navy blue, or brown, manifests various degrees of transparency and saturation, evoking a tension between the geometry of the support and the technique's liquid application. So this is a close-up of one of these watercolors. At times, the color emphasizes the surface plane, while at others it seems to float in an evanescent background. Some sequences of forms reappear across multiple sheets, but always transformed, rotated, mirrored, elongated, or differently hued. And this is also very much played out in the Lichtwand series, right? As you see the shapes repeat, but also with always a kind of permutation in terms of the color and composition, but there's, something that unifies them as a set. But are these watercolors, the cobrasipo, essentially geometric abstractions, or do they represent something beyond an elaboration of their own underlying structure? The title of the series, Cobrasipo, or vine snake, that is, an animal named after a plant, suggests one answer, namely that hard and fast distinctions are misleading. As an exhibition title, a leaf-shaped animal draws the hand, mines such a lesson about the capriciousness of divisions and foregrounds it as a primary key for which to understand the artist's work, and more broadly, his exhibition strategy. After all, when we think about this title, what would it mean for an animal shaped like a leaf to draw a hand? Or a phasmid to draw a hand, right? Which phasmids sometimes look like leaves. Of course, hands reappear throughout Steegmann Mangrané's work, be it literally through his holographic image of a hand growing leaves, which is the image that is also used for this exhibition, or through the hand's traces in his embodied and careful application of graphite and watercolor paint. Works like Morphogenesis Crypsis offer a partial answer to what it might mean to have a phasmid draw a hand in the work's elegant wall drawings. These drawings are almost invisible in this slide, I'm sorry, but there are three. There's one here, and there's another here, and then there would be another on the wall here. And then you can barely see it there. But through faint graphic lines, watercolor, a wood stick, and a stick insect, Steegmann Mangrané joins the handmade execution of his watercolor process, its morphogenesis, or growth, through the serial repetition of lines and shapes and their differentiation through color, to his deliberate entanglement of representation and reality in the wall drawings compositions. So this doesn't actually happen in this exhibition, but in the exhibition that I showed you, hidden in plain sight and visually nestled within the warp and woof of the larger wall drawing was a stick insect. While in a similar, smaller drawing in that particular exhibition, a branch stands in for one of the composition's swerving lines. And so you have the branch here, which you see its different coloration on the left. Here, it's as if the stick insect and the branch dictated the abstract hand-drawn compositions so as to secure the coloration and scenery on which the phasmid depends, but also nature's production of this abstract composition that we see in the space of the exhibition. So just as much as the artist deliberately turns to biology for inspiration, and so I would say that biology is one of his great inspirations as well, so too does his exploration of the inorganic and the geometric, or the organic and geometric, ode to Brazilian neo-concrete art and to its conceptualization of the work of art as lively or animate. Lygia Clark, at various points throughout her career, would maintain the following: the work of art is expressed as a living object, like you and I. The surface of a work should be like an organic body, like a living entity, end quote. So I'm showing you here Lygia Clark on the left with a series of her works, which are called bichos. So she moves from the inorganic to the organic in various ways, ultimately affirming that each bicho is a living organism, essentially an active work. And so in these four models of bichos, these are kind of small sculptural works, and they're metal planes with hinges. And so the idea is that a spectator would actually be able to modify the actual composition of the work. But what I'm interested in here, in terms of how she calls these metal works living organisms, is the way that she would often stage and photograph them in natural environments, right? And so she's abutting this kind of metal form, which she attributes to it a kind of liveliness, and then placing it within nature. So as you see here, then here on a dirt ground, again on a kind of cement wall with foliage in the back, and then again on the ground. So I want to come back to the tree of life, or rather, the horizontal gene transfer evoked at the outset of this talk. Indeed, if art history, and I'm an art historian, right, is by necessity a search for filiations and lineages. What shifts in our understanding of this alternative model of art historical transmission if I were to make use of horizontal gene transfer as a metaphor for the discipline's pursuit of affiliations? I'm keen to think of how artistic practice relates to the lateral transfer of ideas, concepts, and materials, both organic and inorganic, and how such a heredity arrives not only due to some vertical chronological evolution in the way one traditionally imagines, like heredity from parents to children, or through adjacency, through sibling rivalry, but how lineage also comes from the outside, from other aesthetic and cultural constellations that are always, already, never one's own. As an art historian, at times I intuitively perceive the lateral transfers that recur throughout Steegmann Mangrané's practice. At other times, I deliberately identify them, noting how they stem from what might seem otherwise separate art historical traditions or even national and regional narratives. By that I mean, when looking at his Tangled Tree, I ask what it might mean or what it might owe to a work of a Jewish German immigrant to Caracas, Gego, and I'm showing you on the left one of her chongros from 1970, or how his use of colored filters in the structure Oranges from 2011 or 2001, which is also on view in the exhibition, unwittingly recalls Carlos Cruz Diaz's Labyrinth for a Public Space in Paris, which similarly used these kind of filters in 1969. Just as much as the artist deliberately turns to what's called within contemporary art the new materialisms for inspiration, so too does his exploration of the organic and geometric ode to art history. As I mentioned before, his work owes in part to the afterlife of Brazilian neo-concretism and conceptualizations of the work of art by artists such as Lygia Clark as a living organism. Within art history, such formal, material, and conceptual displacements across space and time displace essentialist assumptions that would take a naturalized conception of identity, be it biological or cultural, as foundational to one's artistic authority. In short, Steegmann Mangrané's artistic inheritance is an entangled one of his own design. But to appreciate such an entangled genealogy, do viewers need to know that the artist lived and studied in Barcelona in the 1990s, and that during these years, Barcelona and the Tapias Foundation, more specifically, was host to some of the first major exhibitions of geometric abstraction from Latin America? Or that at that time, Manuel Borjavier, now artistic director of Reina Sofia, was at the Tapias Foundation's helm and responsible for helping to organize the first international retrospective exhibitions of Elio Itizica and Lygia Clark in 1992 and 1997, respectively. Or perhaps, since the artists we're speaking about grew up in Barcelona and lived in Barcelona, perhaps in the year 2000 at MACBA, we saw the seminal Force Fields, an exhibition that proposed a transversal journey through art history, focusing on how matter, energy, and space emerged as key to artists engaged with abstraction, but also for, and I quote, new ways of understanding the body and space in the body. In fact, I always wonder if you saw the Blinky Palermo exhibition in 2002 to 2003 at MACBA and considered whether what I call Palermo's wonky painting had any relevance in the artist's approach to his art. And then I'm showing you here some of Palermo's works on paper, and just below it, the Lichtwang series, which is on exhibition here. Key here is that such exhibitions provided his own experiential equivalent to what film critic Serge Denis described as devouring another education parallel to the one offered in the classroom. In short, the space of cinema was for Serge Denis what the space of exhibition is for Steegmann Mangrané, another site of perceiving and thinking other possible configurations of the world. In relation to artist exhibitions, Steegmann Mangrané maintains, and I quote, "Art has the capacity to reconfigure our relation with and to reality. I like to do my shows not as conclusions, but as points of departure. Somehow the exhibition is an opportunity to set up a thesis, to see how it operates, how it evolves, which consequences it has. The important thing is not the exhibition itself, but what happens when you exit it and confront reality again. His works break with dualisms such as mind and matter, nature and culture, cutting across such oppositions to introduce qualitative shifts in our understanding of what is inert and living, passive and active. As his table with objects also suggests, he takes as his material the relations between objects and subjects, the organic and inorganic, whereby the shifting contours of what constitutes life remain in play. To engage his work and the exhibition, A Leaf-Shaped Animal Draws the Hand, is to engage the possibilities of mutual transformation, how one becomes, and in becoming, becomes entangled with. Thank you.